Explaining the key components of the boilerplate global.css. The first line imports a custom font from Google Fonts. If you do this, it always has to be put on line 1. Wildcard selector. The wildcard or universal selector asterisk in CSS matches any element in the HTML document, including all its descendants. This means that this CSS rule will apply the following 3 properties to every single element on the page. Margin, 0. This sets the margin of every element to 0, effectively removing any default spacing around it. Padding, 0. This sets the padding of every element to 0, effectively removing any default spacing within it. Box sizing, border box. This sets the box sizing property of every element to border box. This means that the width and height of the element includes the content width and height as well as any padding and border widths. This is often a preferred setting as it can make it easier to lay out elements without worrying about unexpected changes to their dimensions. By using the universal selector with these properties, you can easily reset the default styling of all elements on the page, which can help to create a consistent visual style across the entire website or application. More on the box sizing, border box property. The box sizing, border box property changes how an element's width and height are calculated. By default, the width and height of an element do not include the padding and border. This means that if you add padding or a border to an element, its actual width and height will be greater than the specified width and height. This can cause unexpected layout issues. The border box value, on the other hand, includes the padding and border in the element's width and height calculation. This means that the specified width and HT will be the actual width and height of the element, even with padding and a border. So, when you set an element's box sizing to border box, the element's content box will be resized to fit any added padding or borders, rather than the other way around. In summary, setting box sizing, border box makes it easier to design and control the layout of elements, as you can more accurately predict how much space an element will take up on the page. Selecting both body and HTML. Selecting both body and HTML elements in CSS is a common technique used to ensure that the CSS styles are applied consistently across all browsers. The reason for selecting both body and HTML elements is that different browsers may have different default styles for these elements. For example, some browsers may set the body element to have a margin or padding by default, while others may not. By selecting both elements and setting their height and font properties, you can ensure that your page looks the same across all browsers. Additionally, the HTML element is the parent element of the body element, so by selecting both elements, you can ensure that any styles applied to the HTML element will also be inherited by the body element. In the example provided, setting the font family and font size properties on both body and HTML will ensure that all text on the page is styled consistently, while setting the height property to 100% will ensure that the height of the page is always equal to the height of the viewport, regardless of the content inside it. There are 3 style rules that make the footer element always appear at the bottom of the viewport, even if the content of the main element is short or non-existent. Body. This code sets the display property of the body element to flex, with a flex direction of column to make it a flex container that stacks its children vertically. The min height property is set to 100 VH, which means the body element will always be at least as tall as the viewport height. Main. This code sets the flex property of the main element to 10 auto, which means the element will grow to fill all the available space in the container, but will not shrink below its content size. The margin top property is set to auto, which will push the main element to the top of the available space, leaving the remaining space at the bottom for the footer element. Footer. This code defines the style for the footer element, including its height, background color, text alignment, and padding. Menu system explained. Menu-area A. This rule applies to the anchor tags within the .menu area element, which is typically used to represent the links in a navigation menu. This rule makes the link elements flex containers, and aligns the items within them to be both vertically and horizontally centered using align items, center and justify content, center. The text color is set to white, and the background color to a dark gray. The height of each link is set to 60 pixels, and the text decoration is removed with text decoration, none. Menu-area A hover. This rule applies to the same elements as the previous rule, but only when the user hovers over them. This changes the color of the text to red. .menu-area UL. This rule applies to the UL element within the .menu area container, which is typically used to represent the list of links in a navigation menu. This rule removes the default list style and makes the UL element a flex container. .menu-area LI. This rule applies to the LI elements within the .menu-area container. This sets the position to relative, which allows us to position the drop-down menu, if one is present. The width is set to 100% to ensure that each list item takes up the full width of the menu. The text align property is set to center, which centers the text in the list item. Finally, the display property is set to inline block, which allows us to position the drop-down menu next to the list item. .menu-area li hover .dropdown greater than symbol li. The greater than symbol in the CSS selector is known as the child combinator selector. It is used to select only the direct child elements of a particular parent element. In the given code, the selector .menu-area li hover .dropdown greater than symbol li selects all the li elements that are direct children of an element with the class dropdown, which in turn is a descendant of an li element that is currently being hovered over within an element with class menu-area. This selector applies the CSS rules to the selected li elements when they are being hovered over by the mouse cursor. The display property is set to block, which makes the element visible and flow as a block element, and setting the top and left properties to 0, which positions the element at the top left corner of its parent element. .dropdown li. This rule applies to the li elements within the .dropdown container, which is typically used to represent the drop-down menu in a navigation menu. This rule hides the drop-down menu by default with display none. The position property is set to relative, which allows us to position the drop-down menu with respect to its parent element. .dropdown. This rule applies to the .dropdown container, which is typically used to represent the drop-down menu in a navigation menu. This rule sets the position property to absolute, which allows us to position the drop-down menu with respect to its parent element. The display property is set to flex, which makes the drop-down menu a flex container. The flex direction is set to column, which stacks the drop-down menu items vertically. Finally, the width is set to 100%. The reason why position, relative property is used twice. In this CSS code, the position, relative property is used twice. The first instance is in the .menu-area li selector, which sets the positioning context for any absolutely positioned child elements. The second instance is in the .dropdown selector, which positions the drop-down menu absolutely within the containing block of the parent element. By default, absolutely positioned elements are positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, so in this case, the position, relative property on the parent li element establishes the containing block for the drop-down menu. The .menu-area li hover .dropdown li selector then sets the display, block, top, 0, and left, 0 properties for any direct child li elements of the .dropdown element that is a descendant of the hovered li element. By setting position, relative on the parent li element and position, absolute on the child .dropdown element, the drop-down menu can be positioned absolutely within the parent element and still be correctly positioned relative to the parent element when it is opened. I hope this clears up some of the confusion. For more information, ask 3 before me. And maybe you should Google it.